This is TWiT.
I think a little snoot right now wouldn't be.
You ready?
I wouldn't be adverse. Yes.
I have been holding off doing this whiskey for a while because I was trying to figure out why it's as revered as it is. We're talking today about Lagavulin. Now, admittedly, I've been running through the classic malts, that collection that United Distillers put together in the late 80s, because they are great whiskeys without a doubt. But I don't drink a ton of Islay. Like, let's be clear. It's Peat's interesting to me, but it's rare that I really want it, right? I'm not a cigar smoker. Like, if you're going to drink a peaty whiskey, you want to have a cigar.
Kill your taste buds first. I think that's fair. Yeah.
The only time that I find I crave it is when we're doing a whole day of like smoking meat, right? Like if I for a while there, we were doing annual summertime brisket competitions. And if you're steeped in hickory smoke anyway, the smoky whiskey makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Saturated.
And so, I mean, I'm glad I spent time on this. I've gotten too into researching whiskey now. This has gotten out of control.
That's good. This is good.
I feel like I got to the bottom of Lagavulin.
You're our own little Scarlett Johansson smart chat GPT.
So, look, the Islay was making whiskey before whiskey was a legal product. There is evidence that there was a distillery on the site of where Lagavulin is today in 1742. Wow. And in fact, it was referred to even then as Lagavulin. The first license to make whiskey on that location was taken out by a guy named John Johnston in 1816. It's very likely he was licensing what was already there. That was likely his. And, these were not really businesses in a lot of ways. This is a way that you used up barley in those early days. So they changed hands a bunch of times, and I could run them all down, but who cares? Where it becomes important is when the Mackey family takes control of it. And really in 1889, when Peter Mackey gets it, because Peter Mackey is one of the original gods of contemporary whiskey for as far back as this. So his uncle, James Logan Mackey, passes away. He takes it over. And this is when they've got a couple of different distilleries. And so he rebrands the whole group as Mackey and Co. And one of the products that Mackey and Co. started making then, this is 1889, is a product called White Horse, which is a blended whiskey where the base of the blend is Lagavulin. So, people wanted an inexpensive whiskey. And again, one of the things I love about the story, you can still buy White Horse today. It's still out there. I looked it up I think it was on Bevmo, and I found the 60 ounce, the 1.75 liter, $30.
Wow.
Right? $30. Hard to argue. Peter Mackey made a bunch of distilleries. He's also responsible for the Craigellachie, which is the place. I drink a little of the whiskey because it's not my favorite. It's the Speyside. That's the hotel I prefer to hang out when I'm in the area. It's the old train station and so forth. It's sort of in the center of Speyside. You're a stone's throw from McAllen and just down the road from Dufton and all the good stuff. When Peter Mackey passes away in 1924, he's got a bunch of partners. The company's been wrestling around, but they actually renamed the whole group White Horse Distillers, which will then be acquired by the Distillers Company, which, and DCL, the Distillers Company Limited, is best known, I mentioned this a number of shows ago, for making a customized strain of yeast. We're recognizing that Pasteur first identified the very first bacterium in the world as a bacterium, and it was brewer's yeast. And so DCL tailored a yeast that virtually every distillation company used for some period of time, although they've diversified them there. And DCL is also one of the ancestors of Diageo, along with United Distillers. Like most distilleries, had a tough time during the Prohibition, shut down over World War II. They make a note that they only got electricity to the factory in 1948. So you think about that place was making whiskey for a couple of hundred years without electricity. Big fire in 51 that forced a big rebuild. Like many of the distilleries, as things got rough in the 70s and 80s, in 1974 they stopped doing floor mountings. And then in 88, when United Distillers has control of it, they declare the classic malts. And we've talked about this a bunch of times, right? The 6 different whiskeys. And what's hilarious is that according to the paperwork, when they added Lagavulin to the mix, because it was a peated whiskey and people don't like peated whiskey, they said it wasn't going to sell well, right? Dalwhinnie, some of the others that we've talked about there, that group, Cragganmore, those are the ones that are going to sell well. And they were wrong. Lagavulin outsold them all by miles. And it was the first peated whiskey that really took off. It started the revolution. And by the way, they had not laid up enough. They didn't have enough. So now they were in a panic to actually try and make more and did all these things. Like it got nuts. Now, and then of course, 97 Diageo takes it over, which is where we are today. And the page that I've sent you to, themalts.com, that's actually owned by Diageo. They have all these different products there. Now, what is the deal with peat? We've talked about this a bit before. And
Good way to put it. What's the deal? What's the story with peat?
I said about my friend Pete all the time. What's the deal?
Yeah. So it turns out peat is partially decomposed vegetable matter.
I knew it.
Probably different than...
I knew it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And partially decomposed because it ends up in a peat bog. And a peat bog is an acidic bog, which slows down decay. And so it sort of gets trapped in what would arguably be a high carbon state. And so literally for millennia, humans have been aware of the value of peat, and that you can cut it out into bricks, you can dry it, and you can burn it. And so Islay, which happens to not have a lot of trees with its southwest exposure, this is how people heated their homes. And so peat was not a feature. It was an unfortunate byproduct of the fact that this is how you made heat. And when you wanted to distill something, you need some heat. And so they burned that. In fact, there are references in the early 1800s to the peat reek of Islay, right? Yep. That it was not a feature. It was an unfortunate thing. Now, this is not common in the rest of Scotland because Scotland is the origin of the coal revolution, right? The first coal seams, James Watt, all that stuff. That happens there, and coal is the rock that burns. Coal is the product that was saving the forest. This is how it was referred to at the time, right? We would deal with acid rain later, but the fact that you had the rock that burns, it got distributed, and so of course you don't have those peat flavors. And then, of course, rail lines come along as part of this process, right? You have concentrated energy in the form of coal. You can burn it in a pressurized tank along with Watt's engine, and ta-da, you're able to move coal around to a lot of these places. And so coal comes to most of the rest of Scotland, the Highlands, Speyside, the Lowlands, all those areas, because of rail, have access to coal, so that's what they use. But Islay, being an island, and same for Jura and Arran and the other islands, they don't get train lines because you can't put a train through water. And so they continue to use peat because that's what they have, right? Highland Park up in Orkney, peated. That's just the way it is. Although some distilleries, as whiskey becomes more popular, come to appreciate the value of peat and start doing combinations of a little bit of peat in their heat, as well as using coal for their heat. So this is drying the malt, right? So that's where the flavor comes into play. Oh, and there is a point that's made in a few different documents along the way that coal was being taxed, but peat wasn't being taxed. And the one thing the Scots appreciate is not having to pay taxes they don't have to pay.
Yep.
So here's an aspect, and I ended up reading a whole paper on this that I hadn't thought about, but peat has terroir. That is to say, different peat from different locations.
Kind of is has terroir.
It is literally dirt, so that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it literally is terroir.
Can't argue.
So one of the things in the composition of the peat on the islands, like Islay and Arran, is seaweed. That there is a lot of seaweed in it. And so so we talk about in peated whiskeys from Islay having that sort of iodine, salty flavor. And part of the argument of that is that it's the composition of the peat itself, where when you do see peat used in the Highlands, is typically what they call heather peat, that it was the ground cover of the area making the peat. And so it has a different flavor. The peatiness of whiskey is measured in phenolic levels. They call it in parts per million. And
TPUs. No, what was the what's the AI measurement? The, tops.
Yeah, tops.
It's measured in tops.
And so, and one of the reasons this measurement system came along is, like I mentioned, in the 70s, when they stopped doing their own floor maltings, they started buying their barley already malted. And then peat gets introduced during the malting. So you have to be able to order it in the right concentrations. And so Lagavulin has peat phenolic levels of 45 parts per million. That's sort of where you aim it at. And as the peat thing took off and we started getting into peatier whiskey, so like the original Octomore from Bruichladdich, which was famously this very peaty whiskey, 100. Although today their masterclass edition, the BO39, which I've tasted and do not recommend, 300. So that's a lot of peat. Right? But the fact is, because you needed to be able to order it to specification, they had to standardize a lot of this stuff. And I would be remiss not to mention this last point about peat, which is that it is a massive carbon store, and burning it releases all that carbon back into the environment, which has become a huge issue. And there are large initiatives to restore the peatlands. So to protect that land.
The peat.
And as industrialization of maltings has improved, there are ways to introduce the phenolic flavors of peat into the barley without cutting peat out of the ground and burning. Anyway, we were talking about Lagavulin. Sorry for the sidetrack. But don't worry, there's at least one more before we're done today. The Lagavulin distillery has gone through many, many iterations, including the major burn down in 51 and so forth. Today, it is a contemporary distillery, lots of electronics, but rooted in the fundamentals still. They did switch to stainless mass tons a couple of decades ago, but they've stuck with the cypress wood washbacks. They've got 10 washbacks. They used yeast cream, and I only bring that up because both of you react strongly when I say yeast cream. And when I saw it, it's like, oh, I'm including that because it seems to amuse the boys. They only have 4 stills. They are very large stills, 2 washes and 2 spirits. The lie arms on the wash stills are unusual. They kind of curve up and then curve back down again and flatten out, which, lie arms are a whole study unto their own because it changes the reflux of the still. Their spirit stills have much straighter arms. Their new make is considered low. It comes in at 68 or 69%, where many distilleries are higher than that. I think that's got a lot to do with the age of their stills. Of course, they barrel at 63.5 because they barrel in bourbon, and pretty much you always barrel at 63.5 because the Americans make bourbon in their barrels at 62.5. And so you come in a percentage point higher to pull certain flavors from the wood, and virtually all Lagavulin is initially aged in American first use bourbon barrels. They finish in sherry casks. And the amount varies depending on how the flavors are coming. All right. I debated whether I was going to do this, but I can't see how I don't. Let's talk about Ron Swanson. You know who Ron Swanson is?
From Parks and Rec?
From Parks and Rec. So in
is
the
that
character,
what he drinks is Lagavulin?
That is correct.
Oh my God, that's hysterical.
And it became a thing. Okay, so but I mean, you can give or take. I can pick up or leave Parks and Rec. It doesn't change my life.
To me, he is the reason you watch Parks and Rec.
He's amazing. Yeah,
without a doubt. I mean, a character that's far lived beyond. So here's the joke. Of course, Swanson has these great monologues, and he talks about Lagavulin and so forth. And at some point, one of the producers finally clues in. They've done all this free advertising for Lagavulin and contacts the distillery and just says, I don't know if you know this, but we make this comedy show, and one of our characters drinks Lagavulin, and they're like, oh no, we're well aware. and apparently they get along to the point where they end up writing a story, a multi-parter, where Ron Swanson goes to the UK and ultimately goes to Lagavulin.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the actor behind Ron Swanson is Nick Offerman. And genuinely, Nick Offerman not only loves Lagavulin, but loved the crew, like the people there. They liked everything about it. And they've been collaborating ever since to this day.
That's great.
One of my favorite, arguably my favorite thing of this entire thing was Nick Offerman made a Yule log video, 10 years ago, where he literally sat and sipped Lagavulin 45 minutes, never said a word.
I love it.
And it starts with him digging peat, which is hysterical.
Yeah. Fire in the background, sitting in a chair, amazing. Looking you dead in the eye and taking a sip of Lagavulin. Yeah. There's a 10-hour version of this, by the way, but it is clipped together. There are cuts, but the 45-minute version, Nick Offerman did that.
One shot.
It is genuinely a real shot.
I love it.
You've got it up on the screen now. They do the pullback.
There's the bottle.
They leave it there.
Yeah.
And it just stays.
It's my favorite Yule log.
It's the best. Amazing. It's truly great.
God, how did I not know about this?
So they asked Nick Offerman if he wanted to get involved in making whiskey. He's like, yeah, I do. And so in 2019, they put out a version of Lagavulin called the Offerman first release, which is an 11-year-old. And then a couple of years later, they did a version where they finished in Guinness casks. They called Offerman's second release. And just last year, the Offerman third edition, they did in charred oak, which was new oak charred off. And like last week, they announced a Caribbean rum cask finish called Offerman's fourth.
I see this Offerman on the page. I didn't realize it was that Offerman.
It's Nick Offerman.
Oh,
it's
that's
literally
hysterical.
That. It's this. Okay.
I'm sorry to interject here, but the best part of this Nick Offerman Ulog video is that, like all YouTube videos, it has most replayed sections.
Yes.
And nothing new happens in those sections.
No.
Like, it's like
Yeah.
he's just sitting there
Sipping.
holding and or drinking a glass of whiskey.
That's it. That's all it is. So, look, there's a bunch of editions of Lagavulin because that's what Diageo does, right? And the 12-year-olds, the 11-year-olds who distill this edition, I mean, if you really dig around, they get as old as 37 years old.
Is it better?
No. There's one. There is one. There is. Look, don't waste your time. There is one. The Lagavulin 16 is the one. It is the whiskey they referred to as part of the classic collection back in 88. It should be on your shelves today. If you're going to have one Islay, this is the one. If you want to get introduced to Islays, this is the one. It's $100 in America to own a Lagavulin 16. You will not drink it quickly. I know. Now, some folks will describe it as licking a dirty ashtray. I think the polite term is it is drinking a campfire. And so for me, it's very much a mood. I'm always the person who says, like, look, I like the whiskey in front of me, and I will drink it. And I do enjoy it, but only at times. How often do I pick it?
The person that moves in a circle as the smoke from the fire moves. Like, I don't want to be in front of it.
Yeah.
You know?
And if you don't care, then you should drink your Lagavulin.
When you see whiskey snobs,
mm-hmm.
they often say, "Oh, you got any Lagavulin?" Like that's like the king. That sounds like that's a kind of a tell of a phony whiskey snob.
So this gets back to that whole classic malts deal. So when United Distillers put together those classic malts, then they marketed it.
Right.
So you can, here's the kicker. And and Paul's certainly seen this. I go to a bar, I quickly go study their whiskey collection, and I knew who sold it to them. I know by what's on the wall. And so if you see Dalwhinnie, Cragganmore, Talisker, Lagavulin, they bought the classic malt collection, right? They were pitched that, they bought them all.
Well, and to be fair, that may also be what people come in and ask for. So
sure, because it's what they know.
Oh, right? Yeah.
So they got to give people what they want.
I'm going to dress like this at Bill next week. I'm going to wear that jacket with jeans and a flannel shirt and walk around with a glass of whiskey. That's going to be my thing.
That's going to be your look the whole time. They're being confronted with a wall of a couple of hundred whiskeys is terrifying, right? That is the paradox of choice. What was brilliant about the classic collection was it was 6. It's enough. You can try them all. Right. And it's just picking enough. And it's not Glenfiddich, right? The original single malt that was marketed first, the only. There's lots of places we go and they'll have Fiddick and nothing else. That's their one single malt. It's the easiest to get access to. It's well known. The next stage past this is the classic malts collection, and that's what a lot of people know and how they anchor on that. And if you can stomach Lagavulin, like if that flavor doesn't turn you off, it's a style thing because most people pick it up and go, "What? Why would you drink this? Like, I'm afraid you picked up the ashtray instead of the glass." But it's got a finesse to it. It is a beautiful drink. Once you get past that initial smoky hit, this thing has all that sort of briny, iodine, like the sitting in front of the campfire thing. It's absolutely real. And it's a groove, an ounce into this, everything's fine. You're fine. and you're in a place.
It's always true.
You know what? The place we're in right now, the end of the show.